There's a new piece called If You're Rich, You're More Lucky Than Smart, and there's math to prove it, that has been making the rounds the last day or so. And it's very well written, although it's a little bit short on sort of like this actual science and data backing up that claim. But it's a really interesting topic that I want to talk about because it's something that I've been talking about for a long time. And that's that we like to think of our society as a meritocracy, right? One where people have what they've earned and what they deserve because of the actions they've taken and the decisions they've made and their talent and their intelligence and so on and so forth. And especially if you're a defender of sort of the unregulated, so-called free market capitalism, you want to push this idea, right? That the system, if it's unequal because people have what they deserve, people have what they have earned. And it's a way to sort of rationalize or feel better about the insane inequality that we have in our society. That being said, most reasonable people would understand that that's not exactly right, that it doesn't really just work out that everybody gets exactly what they deserve and it's based on talent or intelligence or whatever other metric you want to point to. So for an example, when you look at class mobility, right, we know that upward mobility is really low in the United States. Even equally smart people with similar parenting situations and adjusting for other factors, if you're born poor, it is much more likely that you will end up living a life of a poor person or a lower middle class person than if you were to be born rich. We just know that, right? And it disconnects from the distribution that we have of intelligence or so-called talent or industriousness or whatever factor you want to look at. But once you accept that, there's still this idea that if you do become rich, whether you started poor, lower middle class or upper middle class, that if you end up rich, you did it again on your merits. You worked hard, or you're smart, or a combination of the two. And there's now a study from the University of Catania in Italy, which looks at the role of chance in life success, or we might say it looks at the role of luck, some people call it, or randomness. We can use these terms sort of interchangeably for our discussion here. And what sort of got Professor Alessandro Pluchino looking at this is that he noticed, as many other people have, that there's a sort of 80-20 distribution of wealth, that 20% of the people have about 80% of the wealth, but that the skills and the talent seem to follow a much more standard distribution bell curve pattern. So then simple mathematics questions why it is that that would be the case if there is not some element of randomness, right? What accounts for the concentration of wealth in a way that separates or doesn't track distribution of talent and intelligence, because it is really, really unequal. Like I gave you the 80-20 number, 20% of people have 80% of the wealth. The richest 1% have about 50% of the world wealth. And what this study and others have found is that increasingly the answer is luck. Luck doesn't literally need to mean luck like casino luck type of thing, which I believe is just odds, of course, but it includes elements of what we might call luck or odds, such as the timing of when you start a business or when you graduate with a particular degree that puts you on a path to prosperity of sorts. There's a lot of these factors that you don't control. If you had been born 2 years earlier or 2 years later, the same talent, the same characteristics would not have led to the same prosperity that they might have in the real world. Luck can also just be having born to a rich family, right? That's a huge predictor of wealth. Were you born to a rich family? That's a different sort of type of luck, or I guess we'd call it chance. And what Professor Pluchino did is to run some simulations and rerun them time and again, distributing wealth to people on the basis of certain levels of skill, intelligence, ability, talent, and the factor that ended up creating the distributions that we see in the real world, right? This extreme inequality is to add an element of randomness, which we could attribute to, like I said, timing, right place, right time, rich parents, whatever else the case may be. Every time that Professor Pluchino and his team reran the simulation, the results differed slightly. But what was always the case was that the wealthiest 20% were not the most talented 20%. And it was so lopsided that randomness, which in the real world we call luck or timing or whatever, played a huge role. And it pushed some people into the top in terms of wealth, regardless of ability, and it kept a ton of people with no shortage of ability or intelligence or industriousness out of being top earners. So there's no question that this one study isn't all encompassing. It doesn't account for every variable, right? But increasingly, we are learning that we simply do not have a meritocracy as many people think that we do. And this relates to one of the underlying principles of my political philosophy, which is where I end up disagreeing with lots of people on the right. If you believe that there is a direct one-to-one relationship between effort and success, or between intelligence and success, you are willing to accept certain economic systems. Only when you realize that your success, although it might seem inevitable or obvious to you, was the result of, in great part, chance or timing or odds or luck, whatever word you want to use, you should, if you're a reasonable person, rethink how society should be organized. And this connects to one of the most interesting political philosophies, which is a theory of justice by John Rawls. Rawls published a theory of justice in 1971. And the brilliant thing about a theory of justice is that it suggests if we were to come together to figure out how to organize society, right? If we said, let's meet and say, forget about how society is organized. Let's come up all together on a plan. We should do it from what Rawls calls an original position, which means if I come to the table to figure out how to organize society, I don't come in and design society to work for me if I'm already David Pakman, the owner of an established business with a few employees, and I already own a house, right? I need to design a society that I would accept if I were back at zero and I didn't know what my luck of the draw would be. Would I be born into a very poor family or very rich family? Would I be born somewhere with more economic opportunities or fewer? And the premise is that if you don't know which straw you will draw in life, you're going to be much more incentivized to actually think about what sort of an organization makes sense, regardless of whether you're rich or upper middle class, but for everybody. It's a thought experiment for sure, Pat. And I think it's an interesting one. I don't know if you're familiar with Rawls's theory of justice, but increasingly, luck plays a big role in success.
Yes, I am familiar with the theory of justice. And for Rawls, the solution wasn't a free market or everyone being equal. It was providing a strong social welfare system and still allowing that upward mobility. And to the broader point, maybe luck should be a factor because we want to encourage entrepreneurship, we want to encourage risk-taking, but it shouldn't be the top thing. I mean, intelligence, how hard you work, that should rank at the top, I think.
Yeah, and actually, I would argue, even if you don't have those things, you should still actually have an opportunity to live a good life. And I think that's the flip side of it, that sometimes we see this and we say, success shouldn't depend on luck, it should depend on skill. But are we saying that if you happen to be born lacking particular skills or predispositions to do well in certain areas, that you shouldn't have a good life? I would say absolutely not. And none of this is to say people don't earn what they have, right? It's about recognizing that doing what it takes to earn things can work or not work based on circumstances that are beyond your control. And we should be aware of that when we think about how to organize our world. And part of the resistance that people have to thinking about society this way is they don't want to admit, or maybe they don't believe, or maybe they don't know that chance plays a huge role in where you end up in life. Nobody really wants to believe that, particularly if you've done well. If more people knew that, they'd be much more willing to consider how society should be organized, again, if they didn't know what their place within it was going to be. Check out John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. Really, really important document, and really nothing surprising in this study whatsoever. The video you just finished watching was made possible by you through the membership program. You can sign up for membership at davidpakman.com/membership. We are viewer-supported independent media. You can use the coupon code IVoted17 for a 40% discount off of your membership.